an original
from Story Studio Network.
I'm Dave Trafford, and this is the 2030 Project. The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. After 3 years of consultations, legislative crafting, committee reviews, and political pushing and pulling in the House of Commons and in the Senate in Ottawa, the Canada Disability Benefit Act finally received royal assent on June the 21st, 2023. It's intended to raise those living with disabilities in Canada out of poverty. Can it? Will it? We're hearing from a number of Canadians who already rely on disability pensions across the country, and they're saying any additional benefit will be good enough. At the same time, it's universally agreed that provincial support plans are already inadequate. So let's tackle the question of adequacy. To help us do that, we are joined by advocates and activists from across the country. They have lived experience, and they have been on the front lines of this push to make the Canada Disability Benefit Act a reality. Let's meet our guests.
My name is Adrian Merdzan. I'm a staff lawyer at the Income Security Advocacy Center.
I'm Andrea Hatala, and I am the recipient co-chair of the ODSP Action Coalition.
I'm Bill Adair. I'm the executive director of Spinal Cord Injury Canada. I'm also involved as a member of the Minister's Disability Advisory Group and a member of the board of directors of Accessibility Standards Canada.
We started this conversation in early on in the first episode where we had our roundtable, and we really did emphasize that the approach here to the Canada Disability Benefit is, and as we put meat on the bone, figuratively speaking, the nothing about us without us is critical to making sure that next steps here are effective and can actually have some a long-term benefit for those living with disability. Andrea, I think that when we look at that marching order, nothing about us without us, is unique, it's exciting, but at the same time, it's never really been done before. So we're taking steps into new areas that can be good, that can be considered innovative. But in some cases, it makes it all the more challenging because we really are carving out a new path in terms of how we really create muscle around this legislation, no?
It's a new path for creating this legislation, but it's something that's been going on for a long time. Like, nothing about us without us has existed for a long time, and many of the many things that I've been involved in, and it really helps because the people, the bureaucrats that make that put together these benefits sometimes, like ODSP, they didn't really know about the lived experience of people, and the benefits were put together with certain assumptions where people didn't really kind of understand what the experience of people on the benefit would be like. And so I'm really thankful that they are including us in this, because now we get to state our opinions. No, that isn't a good regulation, and no, it isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z.
Well, and I think, Bill, when we talk about that, nothing about us without us, it's a really interesting path or goal here from Andrea's point of view because of the lived experience. But it also helps us inform definitions around eligibility, around accessibility. And the topic we're going to get to is adequacy. This to me seems like it's a fairly bold but necessary first step to get it right.
Well, this is a bold step, and the intentions are good. The question that we all have is, will it actually happen? So to make the regulations actually respond to the true needs of people who live in poverty with a disability means we have to work with them, and we have to take a different approach than just using digital technology and having surveys and having consultations. How do we reach into the community of people with disabilities, the million or more people who are living in poverty, and how do we engage them? How do we make sure that we do this in a meaningful and a significant way? So that's the big challenge. And there are a number of individuals and organizations who are now working with the new minister to explain to her, to educate her what co-design means and what it steps that we can take to actually engage the real people who will become more involved in society because of this benefit.
Well, you touch on an interesting point here, because as we have been recording this, we started with one minister, and since between the last time we talked and we're talking today, we've got a new minister. So I want to come back to that in terms of how this is going to play out. But Adrian, from your point, we're almost, adequacy when we talk about the benefit. It's easy to jump to how much should people get, what should they be getting. But I think Andrea and Bill have also framed a whole new area of adequacy in terms of how we are going, what is good enough in terms of outreach, what is good enough in terms of accessibility. So this has opened up some really interesting, I'll call them opportunities without sounding like we want to be too skeptical about this. But, from your perspective, where, again, nothing about us without us opens up some really interesting laneways, but does it present the possibility of becoming distracted by one over the other?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. My approach on the whole thing is that I'm cautiously optimistic with how this benefit has been rolled out. And I do want to laud the government for its approach and really taking nothing about us without us into consideration. If we look at other benefits that are poverty reduction benefits or disability support benefits, there hasn't been this concerted outreach to try to get in touch with the people that use this benefit. And often what happens in those situations is you have government administrators holding all the cards and kind of assessing and tiering people and trying to fit them within categories. So I'm also hopeful that this process will enable people to have more opportunities to participate and more opportunities to share their lived experience with the government when they're crafting that legislation. I think one key thing will be that there needs to be an opportunity also once the legislation has been crafted for further feedback. The government ultimately holds the pen, and it's important that people with disabilities have an opportunity to give direct feedback on the pen that was crafted.
Well, and I think that's the advantage of at least it being regulatory, and I'm talking to the lawyer here, but but the idea, rather than it being set in stone, that there's something there's a living document here, there's a living program, Adrian, that we can kind of come back to and say, this is working, or this is something we hadn't anticipated, that there needs to be that level of some flexibility built into it and sensitivity, no?
Absolutely. And I just hope that this becomes a process that's continuous in time. And once it's rolled out, there's still opportunities after that point in time to participate within the regulations. This isn't like a one-stop shop, because we have seen in other settings that it can be difficult to move the needle once something is already in place. And so it's important that there are review periods or points in time where disability community can get engaged again with the law and say, okay, this is how it worked. This is what didn't work. Can we now work in a regulation scheme that's more flexible to make those changes after directly hearing from us? Mm-hmm. Because nothing about us without us is important, and it's important to be a process throughout time. It shouldn't just be a process at the initial creation stage. It should exist during the process, and once the benefit is rolled out, and once people are rejected from the benefit, and any sort of concern that arises there should be more concerted efforts to engage them throughout the process.
So part of this, Andrea, and you touched on it already in terms of how ODSP has been developed in Ontario, how it was rolled out, et cetera. And again, when it was initially presented, I have to believe that it was well intended, but based on the framework, and we can talk about the various benefit programs across the country and, jurisdictions, provinces, territories. But similarly, you will find that they set them in stone early, and it became very difficult then to change the framework for criteria of eligibility, et cetera, for something like ODSP. So as negative as that may be, it may in fact be a positive if you point to it and say, don't do it that way. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Another thing, if you're talking about adequacy, and I hate to jump ahead, but if you're talking about adequacy, like there's a lot of clawbacks, like if you work or you have to report your earnings every month, and then a certain amount of your ODSP gets taken away, and that stifles adequacy, like despite what the amount is. So there's a lot of like things that have to be avoided, and like that they can't do it the same way that the provinces did it. It would be better if it was just one amount, and they didn't like have clawbacks or stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and I think Andrea's done us a favor here in pushing the accelerator a bit on the adequacy question, Bill. So let's go there. It sounds like it may be a silly question, and if that's the case, that's my, how I built a career out of asking silly questions. But I'm hearing people use the word adequate and use the word enough. And to my ear, they are different things. And we got to be careful that we do not equate what is adequate for the system and what is considered enough. One policy, expert said to me, well, if you were talking about enough, it's okay if you don't look under the hood. If it's adequate, it's actually what you need to make sure that this program, whatever it may be, moves forward with all the support it needs. Is that fair to you?
Well, it is fair. And Andrea, you've raised a very important point in terms of the benefit being delivered to people who are living in poverty. Does that mean there's going to be a decrease in other benefits that they already are signed up for, or will they become ineligible? But there are some really important factors that need to be figured in this complicated but doable equation around the amount. And this is a big question. So I always start with, what are we intending to do? What is this act intending to do? Well, it's intending to lift people above the poverty line in relation to the province or the territory that they live in. And that the amount must account for additional expenses that each person experiences that are associated with their disability. And severity of disability is one of the factors that needs to be considered. So this is not an easy equation. This is partly why the act is a framework act, and now we have time to dig into the details of how much is this this going to actually pay to people? And our intention is to ensure that people with disabilities live life with dignity, and it supports their social inclusion. So whether we call it advocacy or enough, that's the bottom line is we must lift people above the poverty line based on the additional expenses they face and the province or territory and the region within each of those that they live. So obviously people who live in the north have much higher expenses. It's complicated, but there are all kinds of data about this that can help us work out the equation. And the Maytree Foundation has done some excellent work in terms of poverty and the extra expenses for an individual with a disability who is living in poverty now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Adrian, when we look at those regional distinctions, I mean, I think that's important. That has to be taken into account vis-a-vis what is adequate in Alberta versus what's adequate in Halifax, because there will be differences in terms of services, accessibility, et cetera. But at the same time, again, let me put on the political observer cap here. And in Ontario, they have raised the ODSP payment per their election promise, and then they indexed it to inflation. And, they're suggesting we've done a good job. That's enough. And maybe for now, if not moving forward. But there's reporting out there, I think recently that suggests, I think it was CTV saying they got their hands on documents that said the government of Ontario, for example, has no intention now of putting more money into the system. That may only be part of the story. I begin to wonder if they're waiting for the shoe to drop with the Canada disability benefit to see what kind of money's in there. Then what do we actually add to it? What can we, maybe to Andrea's point, withdraw or draw back on? We're going to play a game in each one of these regions with that balance of numbers. So where governments might end up almost arguing over what their share is, and we lose sight of those who need it most.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that is probably on their minds. I mean, there's a lot that we still need to know, and that's governments included. I think the biggest thing that we're tracking with Ontario and in relation to this new federal benefit is the clawback point that Andrea raised earlier. If they are going to take all this money and claw it back dollar for dollar, then it's actually not going to people living in poverty with disability. It's really going to their pockets. And so we're hopeful that that doesn't happen, but it's important to keep the pressure up on the Ford government and on the Ontario government and the Ontario sphere to recognize that if, as the minister has noted, that this might just be a top-up benefit and not actually fully raise people to the certain level, that both benefits need to work together to ensure that people living with disabilities are lifted out of poverty. And within the Ontario context specifically, you also have to realize that, yes, they have raised ODSP, but sometimes it can be a bit of a misnomer in that we have Ontario Works and on the Ontario Disability Support Program in Ontario. And not everyone with a disability necessarily qualifies for ODSP. And so then you have a sort of tiered system where those people need to rely on Ontario Works as their poverty reduction strategy. But then we've seen no sort of contribution or addition to Ontario Works as a benefit. And so people on Ontario Works only receive $700 a month. And that's in comparison to the raises now that have been put in place with the recent index to inflation of ODSP around $1,300 a month. And I'm using a single person as the example there because it varies depending on the benefit unit. But if you don't qualify under the ODSP definition of disability, and we see that happen frequently with people with mental illness, they're much less likely to qualify than people with physical disability. So you're creating a tiered system there. then you're also going to have to consider possibly raising Ontario Works as well to account for actually addressing disability poverty and ensuring that people don't continue to fall through the cracks of government administration.
Well, when we look at the definitions, and this is what we keep falling on, I guess, Bill, is that criteria is one thing, accessibility is something else. But I think what I'm hearing from the voices involved is that if you already qualify for a program in your province or territory, you shouldn't have to reapply for this benefit. That should be the base. That should be the starting point, even though we acknowledge that there are inequities across the country in terms of how they're administered and who gets the access to it. But all of that shades the question of adequacy, doesn't it? I mean, and Adrian kind of made the point already. If I don't qualify for the disability program in Ontario, I fall into another category, which great, I'm on the plan, I'm getting some benefit, but not necessarily recognizing my disability. If we go with just on the disability plan, those folks who are on Ontario Works would be left out of the picture on the Canada benefit. So then adequacy becomes a bigger issue all around. No, Bill?
Well, it does, and this brings into a sharp focus the importance of collaboration and coordination between the provinces, the territories, and the federal government. So if we identify the poverty line of $27,886 a year as an example that I pull from the Maitri data, how do the different benefit programs work together to make sure that an individual has that amount of money to be able to live a life with dignity? So much depends on the will of the politicians to work together and to collaborate. And I know that there have been discussions initiated already with the provinces and territories on this. Some have gone farther than others, but this has to be a major focus of the work underway, not only to determine that, reach agreements that there won't be any clawbacks, but also to ensure that these benefits programs work together to, again, the objective is to lift people out of poverty. And with respect and love for the Ontario government, they increased ODSP, but it was a drop in the bucket of what people really need to live a life with dignity and to be living outside of poverty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, put the point on it, you're still $900 below the poverty line, and that's being generous. I know you had your hand up, Andrea. What do you want to contribute?
Yeah, that's what I just wanted to say, that even though, it was under the poverty line to begin with, so you have to, ODSP, you would have to raise it up to the poverty line, and then keep it in sync with inflation, right? You because keeping a wage that's about $1,000 a month below the poverty line, keeping that, raising that in accordance with inflation is still not going to get you anywhere. There has to be a raise there has to be a raise in the rates in the first place, and then we can index it to inflation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
that's adequacy.
Yeah. And it's not like people with disabilities that don't qualify for ODSP and are on OW, they are in deeper poverty than we are, and the province thinks that these are just lazy people, and Doug Ford has said this many times. He said it in front of the Empire Club just recently. He said that these are people that could be working and they're not. And Ontario Works is $735 a month, and it hasn't been raised for, oh my God, 5 years, for all the time that Ford has been in power. And so, these people, even though they have disabilities, are worse off than we are. If you can, they just don't make anything per month. $7.35 a month doesn't even really get you a room, in a place to rent. And so, it's those rates have to be raised. And if they don't qualify for ODSP, they're not going to qualify for the Canada Disability Benefit, and that's really tragic.
Well, and when we look at that process, then Adrian, it again, nothing about us without us. This is an important part of this conversation, right? This as a result of not paying attention to the lived experience, that the passion that Andrea brings to the conversation here, we run the risk of creating more poverty if we're not really smart about the way we approach this national benefit.
Yeah, I think when you're creating a benefit, you have to be aware of unintended consequences of your design. You have to, there's obviously great intention here, but we need to ensure that people are easily accessing this benefit. And I know that goes to accessibility and not adequacy, but that's a huge part in getting to adequacy, right? It's getting access to adequacy. And one of the ways that can be done is as some have suggested, this kind of automatic eligibility. If you qualify for ODSP in Ontario, then you automatically get the CDB. At least then you're immediately getting to someone that's already in the system. But it's also about ensuring that those voices that aren't properly reflected in the system, that maybe even can't get Ontario work because they don't have a social insurance number or they don't have another form of identification that's needed, are also being heard throughout this process and being included in that nothing about us without us framework.
Well, and this is all we've kind of circled around government and policymakers, and clearly that's where the focus has been on all of this. But a lot of this discussion also, Bill, lands in the offices of private insurers who some form or fashion supplement or are the sole provider of some of these benefits. That's another complication in terms of bringing them to the table. So do they need to be involved all the way along? Do the governments need to kind of get their act together and then present to the private sector? How do we stick handle that?
Absolutely an important question, and the provincial governments are the ones responsible for working with the private insurance companies. And I think I just want to go back to this concept of people with disabilities who live in poverty are lazy, they should go get a job. Well, I'd like to say that any one of us, if we're struggling for food, if we're struggling to pay rent, if we're living on the street, it's kind of hard to think about getting a job. But I also know that there are many people with disabilities who have enormous talents. They do live in poverty, but given the right support, the talents that they have can come forward and make a contribution to our society, whether it's volunteering, whether it's paid employment, which brings taxes. I think this is an important part of the conversation, is that we're not talking about just a welfare situation. We're talking about advancing our society in a way where everybody is involved, engaged, and can contribute. So will the private insurance companies see that? Depends on how we present it to them. Do the provincial governments see that? Not necessarily. Has our federal government, under the direction and leadership of Minister Qualtrough, seen that? Yes, I think she did, and helped bring us all along with the Accessible Canada Act and now the Canada Disability Benefit Act. But it's so much up to us to bring this benefit to all of society to light. This isn't just taking care of poor people with disabilities. It's unleashing their potential.
Well, and that's an important perspective to put on it, because I think part of the disability that we haven't talked about here, Andrea, is the stigma that goes with it. I mean, we baked the stigma into the system, and that might be the biggest disability and challenge that you face.
Yes, I think that ODSP was created. It was created in 1998 by the Conservative government at the time, by the Conservative provincial government, and it was based on a whole bunch of a lot of stigma, and that's why there was so many stupid rules as part of it. So, and hopefully that's what we're trying to avoid with the nothing about us, without us, thing is silly rules like, people can't get married and there's no double disability benefit, or people that get married get less than single people. Sometimes they don't get twice the amount, just rules for reporting people's income, if they're married, and using the other spouse's income against theirs. So that's kind of, and the reporting technique, making people report their income every month. Those are the workers for ODSP. Sometimes they don't have degrees in social work. So, and the way that they treat the respondents, if you look at the contact forms for the ODSP Action Coalition, that's one of the biggest problems. Is that people have been treated badly by their workers, and so if we could eliminate the middleman with this benefit of having to beg for every nickel and dime and discretionary benefits and stuff like that, just so that you can get a couple more bucks every month, then we won't have to. Then there won't be as many problems.
Yeah, so we've institutionalized the stigma, Adrian, and we've legislated the poverty.
Yes,
when you look at it that way. But here, let's just turn to the cabinet shuffle, and Bill alluded to it off the top of our discussion. When we started this conversation, Carla Qualtrough was the one who was shepherding this, and she has been on the helm for a number of years. I think, by all accounts, is getting good reviews, albeit the ship moved rather slowly. It shouldn't have taken as long as it did for all the consultation to get where we are, but we are here. And, where she's barely doing her victory lap on this, then she gets shuffled out of the portfolio. So now we have a new minister. Kamal Kara is now the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion, and Persons with Disabilities. And I think that's an important thing to note, where this is now a standalone ministry that will, stick handle this particular benefit. And I think that politically speaks well, or optimistically anyway. But, just give me your sense of, how much or little has to be done to keep this ball rolling up the hill with a new minister in a new portfolio as we move into a very critical stage of the legislation.
I mean, first, just to maybe talk to what Bill and Andrea talked about, and to this point too, I think we need to build a more compassionate system than the systems that we have in place. And part of the difficulty that this new minister will face in coming up to speed is that the current systems we have in place in Canada that provide disability benefits, that provide poverty reduction benefits, are not compassionate systems. And so as a part of this framework, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to kind of revolutionize how we view benefit design, how we view accessing benefits, how we view the adequacy of benefits, so that it's responsive to people with disabilities. And oftentimes how benefit administration works is you have an individual who's vulnerable, and they have to go against the state and the government and all of their resources. And I think there's a lot of education for all administrators and all adjudicators that needs to be done to just understand how vast the imbalance is to begin with, how difficult it is for one person to have to prove that they're disabled to someone else, how difficult it is for someone to have to state that their identity is what it is and have to have someone else validate that. And that's the system that we have in place right now. That's how our systems are created. And so and I'm very hopeful that through this Nothing About Us Without Us framework, and I know Minister Qualtrough had started to kind of move the needle on that, which is a huge undertaking. And I do hope that Minister Kara also is able to do that and continue with that good work. Any sort of education on those points is really key to ensuring that this benefit is different than other benefits. And this once in a generation chance we have for Canada to be a leader on this front. And by nature of it being Canada and being the federal government and having the most resources for a government ministry, informing the provinces on their approaches historically and what they've been and how they've failed, and hopefully also encouraging a continued collaboration and continued improvement of their systems so that they don't kind of continue with this punitive state that we're in when we build these systems, and we instead move towards compassion.
Well, it's clearly an important piece of legislation. It's important for the country because this is not just about persons living with disability. This is about the cost of poverty in this country. I throw this number out all the time. People are sick of hearing me say it, perhaps, I would hope. If so, do something about it. In Ontario alone, Ontario Feeds predicted and suggested, based on their research in 2019, that poverty costs the province of Ontario alone $33 billion annually. So, for those who put up their hands and say, how can we possibly afford programs like this? I ask you, how can we possibly afford poverty when it costs us that much money? So here's hoping that this is really the important step forward. We may not have defined or landed on the bigger issue or definition of what is adequate, because I think it is a much broader question, and we'll have to watch it as it develops, and we'll get to that point. But this would be an adequate start, Bill?
It's hopefully a good start. I just wanted to comment on the new minister. Certainly we had a good track record with Minister Qualtrough. I have spoken with Minister Kara. She has committed to engaging with civil society organizations in the disability community, but more importantly, people with disabilities, and has asked for opportunities to meet with multiple stakeholders. So the words are there. Will the action be there? Mm-hmm. It's up to us, people in the disability community, those of us with disabilities, and the organizations we're a part of, to hold her feet to the fire. And we will do so.
Well, we would be happy to extend an invitation to her to finish off our conversation here on the 2030 project as well, because for all of the insights that have come up based on the conversations that I've been lucky enough to have and learn over the course of the last 4 or 5 shows, there's much to be done. But I think that, Nothing About Us Without Us is really an important and an optimistic approach to this. Yeah, Andrea, go ahead. Finish this off.
Okay, well, what I just wanted to say was that, since all of these organizations have been engaged, and disability without poverty is a group of fiery folks that are working with us. So the minister has to get up to speed, but she has to let us take the ball and help her design this benefit. So So let the people with lived experience take the ball, and she can just listen to us.
Yeah, good point. I mean, listening is one thing. If you are heard is something else. I think she has an opportunity to prove that she hears you, not she's just listening to it. So, Bill, Andrea, Adrian, listen, this has been a great conversation. We may have to follow up with you in about 6 months to see where we are, and we'll get your pulse on this. But thank you all for being here. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast that we are proud to produce. It is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank. If you'd like to help eliminate poverty, start by sharing this podcast with your federal MP, your member of provincial parliament, your local municipal representatives, anyone you think needs to hear this message about the Canada Disability Benefit. And to learn more, visit dailybread.ca. Mike Trutler is our technical producer and audio editor here at Story Studio Network, and the 2030 Project is produced by the team at Daily Bread Food Bank. I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for listening.